The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast are composed of many nations and tribal affiliations. The mild climate and abundant natural resources allowed for the rise of complex native cultures. Since the colonization of the Pacific Northwest by Europeans, local tribes have lost as much as 90% of their population. Through a gradual process, the native people of Washington state were pushed off their lands and onto reservations. In Washington state, there are 29 federally recognized reservations. The largest of these are the Colville Reservation, the Spokane Reservation, the Yakima Reservation, and the Quinault Reservation. The Yakima Reservation is the third largest in the U.S. as it is 1.2 million acres and home to 30,000 native people. The Klickitat River, the Yakima River, and Mount Adams are a few of the defining features of this reservation. The Confederate tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation are descendants of 14 tribes and bands that were federally recognized under the Yakima Treaty of 1855.
On June 9, 1855, the native tribes in this area of south central Washington were forced to cede in excess of 6 million acres to the United States government. This was partially a punishment for killing of Methodist missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman by a group of young Cayuse natives. The tribes were paid $200,000 over a number of years in exchange for their land. At the time the treaty was signed, Washington Governor Isaac Stevens assured the people of the Yakima Nation that white miners and settlers would not be allowed to trespass on tribal lands during the time before the treaty could be ratified by the United States Senate. Gold strikes in the Colville area and in the Fraser River area in British Columbia, however, encourage increasingly large groups of miners to invade tribal lands as they cross the region en route to the gold fields. This began the conflict that would come to be known as the Yakima Indian War. The natives eventually lost this war, and by 1858, the Yakima had lost 90% of their traditional lands and were confined to a reservation. Their ability to gather their traditional foods all but destroyed. Many took refuge in traditional beliefs, hoping that in these times these practices would drive out the whites and restore their lands. The Duwamish people are the original inhabitants of modern-day Seattle, Brenton, Bellevue, Tukwila, and Mercer Island. Today, there are only around 600 Duwamish people living in Seattle, and Native people make up less than 1% of the city's total population. In 2015, the Duwamish people were denied federal recognition, meaning they could not receive funding for housing, education, and healthcare, as well as the possibility of a land for a reservation. Today, the Duwamish tribe is led by a chairperson and a 5-member council. The Duwamish Tribal Services provides social and cultural services to Duwamish people.
The state of Washington was established in November of 1889. The high mountains of the Cascade Range run north-south, bisecting the state. To the west lies the Pacific Ocean, and to the east, arid deserts. Both animal and human bones dating back to 13,000 years old have been found across Washington, and evidence of human habitation in the Olympic Peninsula dates back approximately 9,000 BCE, 3 to 5,000 years after massive flooding of the Columbia River, which carved the Columbia Gorge.
We talk a lot about the life and struggles of Native people from America, but not much about Native people from Canada, who are called First Nations people. The borders between the United States and Canada were arbitrarily set by European settlers and traders. This meant that many tribes were permanently broken up by the new borders. While Canada has had a slightly better record on relations with Native people than the United States, they have still mistreated First Nations people for hundreds of years. Canadian relations with First Nations peoples have been in the headlines recently because of Prime Minister Trudeau's approval of expansion of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. The pipeline, which carries oil from Alberta to British Columbia, has been made controversial for environmental and tribal reasons. There have been 82 reported spills since the pipeline's construction in 1961, and it intrudes on the land of the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh tribes and has been the cause of many protests in the last few months. The Canadian government has approved expansion despite these protests.
Many reservations are essentially rural ghettos that are intentionally located as far away from cities as possible. The unemployment rate on reservations is extremely high. Most people living on a reservation either work at a low-paying job or receive some sort of governmental assistance. Many reservations have high rates of suicide, alcoholism, and sexual assault. Living conditions on the reservations have been cited as comparable to Third World. Native people are more prone to diabetes, heart disease, and tuberculosis, and infant death rates are 60% higher than for Caucasians. The vast majority of land on reservations is held communally. This means residents cannot get a clear title to the land where their home sits. This is one of the reasons for the abundance of mobile homes on reservations. There is a growing belief in American society that natives have struck it rich with the establishment of casinos. Much less than half of the reservations in the U.S. own casinos. Many native tribes may never participate in this type of gaming because of their geographic location in rural, unpopulated areas. The total number of jobs created by native-owned casinos nationwide is around 628,000, but up to 75% of these jobs go to non-native employees. Jobs at these casinos are also low-paying and lag behind national wages. Although it is true that tribal casinos improve political strength and quality of life for some native people, many still live in crushing poverty.